Good afternoon and good morning, good evening, everyone, and welcome to our IPCP webinar on setting the stage for the Science Policy Panel on Chemicals and Waste. My name is Martin Scheringer. I'm the chair of the IPCP, and I will just say a few opening words at the beginning of the webinar now. I have a couple of slides to share. So we want to talk about the work towards the Science Policy Panel on Chemicals and Waste. First of all, our audience today is a large audience. We have nearly 500 registrations from 99 countries. We see here from the map that many participants also come from Latin America and Africa and the different regions of Asia, in addition to Europe and North America. And 40% of the audience of you are academics. And so it's again a very warm welcome to all of you, and we hope that the webinar will be useful and interesting to you. The IPCP, the International Panel on Chemical Pollution, is a global association of academic scientists working on chemical pollution issues. It was established in 2008. We have a website, ipcp.ch. We are also on LinkedIn, and you can find at our website our bylaws, the goals, the mandate of the association, and more information about our different activities and projects. A main activity of the IPCP in the last couple of years has been work in the area of the science policy interface for chemicals and waste. For example, 5 years ago, we published this report. It is a mapping and gap analysis of existing science policy interface bodies in the area of international chemicals governance. It's a lengthy report with lots of details. It is available on Zenodo. Then in 2021, when there was more and more momentum coming up for the new intergovernmental panel on science policy panel on chemicals and waste, we were able to publish this piece here in Science, where we outlined why we think such a panel will be useful, and we also discussed and sketched out what it could look like. And then later in 2021, we ran a sign-on campaign that also many of you realized or were participated in, and you gave your support and signature to the call for a strong science policy panel on chemicals and waste. And we were able to obtain nearly 2,100 signatures supporting this call. This was just in preparation for the UNEA 5 meeting in early 2022. And then at that meeting of UNEA, the United Nations Environment Assembly, a resolution was passed that calls for a new intergovernmental panel on chemicals and waste, or officially the Science Policy Panel on Chemicals, Waste and Pollution Prevention. Then to actually move on with this, an open-ended working group was created, an OEWG, and this group was tasked with setting up the structure of the panel and defining what it should look like, what its functions will be, and so on. This open-ended working group has had several meetings already. We had a meeting earlier in early 2023, in January 2023 in Bangkok, and a meeting in Nairobi in December 2023. And there will be a last meeting, OEWG3, in June this year. And we are now preparing work and input and contributions to that last of the OEWG3 meetings. At the meeting in Nairobi last December, OEWG2, many questions were still open and had to be left open because there was not a sufficient consensus and agreement. So many questions about even the functions of the science policy panel, the handling of COIs, conflicts of interest, of the work program, of the institutional setup of the panel will have to be discussed again at the meeting in Geneva in June. Nevertheless, we still want to look now at what, once the panel will be there, what the panel can create as output. Because all these questions here are, in a way, They're very important, but they are technical and somewhat abstract. And one of the big questions, of course, also is what will be the concrete, the tangible outcome of the panel's work. So today we want to look at what the outcomes could be, what they could look like, what we would like to see as outcomes of the work when the panel is there. Of course, these questions about the outcomes are linked back to the open questions about the scope of the panel and the types of issues to be addressed or to be left out from the panel's work, the type of assessment that the panel is supposed to perform. Would it be mostly retrospective assessments, or would it also be prospective assessments, including what's called horizon scanning, looking out for new upcoming issues early on even. And of course, this also depends on the criteria that the panel will use for setting up its work program. To some extent, this may be left even to the panel itself and will not be resolved definitely, or not even defined definitely at the meeting in June. So these are all questions that will define the outcomes, but nevertheless, we think it's important to just more than brainstorm, to just discuss what would be our ideas and wishes for the outcomes of the panel. For this, we could also, of course, look at the existing outcomes of the two other existing intergovernmental panels, IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, and IPBES, the Intergovernmental Science Policy Platform on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services. So, turning to the agenda for today, the first point is that unfortunately one of the speakers who was announced, Katerina Sebkova from Stockholm University, will not be able to be with us today. So we have 3 speakers. We are now at the end of my opening words. I will then hand over to my IPCP board colleague, Penny Vlahos, who will introduce the speakers and also moderate the discussion, first the speeches and then the discussion. And then we have the 3 contributions by Katerina Sebkova and Robert Watson and Rachel Radvany. The speakers will speak for about 12 minutes, and then there will be time for a couple of just clarifying questions, so technical questions for understanding, but not yet really discussion contributions. And after Rachel's presentation and clarifying questions, we will then have time for an open discussion with for everyone to join and to express their interest and ask questions. And then the end, my board colleague and IPCP Vice Chair, Miriam, will wrap up and identify a couple of key points that we will think or will take to OEWG 3 in June. And with this, I hand over to you, Penny.
Thank you, Martin. So welcome everybody again today across all time zones. I have the honor of moderating today's webinar and introducing our panel. All 3 of our panelists will be involved in the 3rd open-ended working group. So they will be on the battlefield. And as I introduce them today, first of all, we have Katerina Sebkova, who is the director of the National Center for Toxic Compounds and of the Stockholm Convention Regional Center, or RECETOX. This is, of course, in Masaryk University in the Czech Republic. She has been a key participant in the science policy panel process from the onset. Sir Robert Watson, who has had significant roles as senior advisor to the World Bank, scientific advisor, chairman of the Global Environmental Facility, chairman of the IPCC, vice president and chairman of IPBES, and he brings a legacy of experience and knowledge to the process. And then finally, we have Rachel Radvany, who is an environmental health campaigner and brings a legal perspective. She works at the Center for International Environmental Law, CIEL. Rachel's worked on several efforts as legislative associate for partnership and policy integration. She's conducted research about environmental justice implications for biomass facility siting. She's also worked at other environmental nonprofits, including the Rachel Carson Council and the National Parks Conservation Association. Our speakers, as Martin said, will have 15-minute time slots in which they will be addressing the questions that were posed to them, and that will allow a couple minutes at the end of their talk, their 15-minute time slot, for clarifications. We'll hold our questions to the open discussion, of course. So following each speaker, you will have the chance to ask a couple of clarifying questions in the chat that we can address. The speakers, for clarity, have been asked 3 key questions. The first is, how do you envision the Science Policy Panel complementing ongoing efforts and avoiding duplication? The second is, what benefits can the Science Policy Panel provide in terms of timelines to reduce human risk? And then what do you envision as a helpful prioritization process? So these are all complex questions that are to be discussed at the third open-ended working group, and it'll give people material to start thinking over as we begin to strategize. So with no further ado, I would like to pass the floor up to Katerina Sebkova.
Thank you very much, Penny. Thank you very much for having me on the webinar today. I have 3 slides basically for you. And the first one is already bringing us to see the global landscape for chemicals and waste collaboration. And we can see it's pretty scattered. We have several global MEAs, so multilateral environmental agreements, but they themselves are limited in scope and in coverage of chemicals. So as you can see, those which have the horizon, they do cover life cycle of a chemical or specific groups of chemicals, such as Stockholm Convention on Persistent Organic Pollutants, or Montreal Protocol on ozone-depleting substances, or Minamata Convention on mercury. But then we have others which rather only look at a very specific sector, be it trade, like, for example, Rotterdam Convention on Prior Informed Consent, that is really rather looking at information exchange regarding the risks of chemicals that are being exported or imported. And then we also have a Basel Convention that is looking at hazardous waste and disposal. So again, a very specific sector. And then we also have another, if you will, global agreement that are done within the under the auspices of the international labor organizations. They are the first actually global instruments available to protect human health and partly also the environment from exposure in the workplace. And they are covering heavy metals, they are covering the organic chemicals, but there is a very, very limited scope of chemicals that are somehow being regulated. Regarding the Science Policy Panel and the interaction with those chemical agreements, we have, of course, some expert groups that exist under each of those instruments. And of course, in the negotiation mandate of the Science Policy Panel, we clearly have a statement that there is non-duplication of work, but rather complementarity, or some overall evaluation if there is a gap. We also have a very helpful network, IOMC, so it's Intergovernmental Organization on Sound Management of Chemicals, that is grouping 9 world organizations, be it World Health Organizations, OECD, ILO, FAO for Agriculture and Food Organization, of course, United Nations Environment Program, and then we have organizations that are also helping in terms of capacity building, if you will. So that's the UNIDO, UNDP, UNITAR, and World Bank. And all of them have done a significant work in the past to advance the field of chemicals and waste, of collaboration, of synergies, of really speeding up and being able to not to be reactive, but try to be proactive, try to prevent any potential poisonings or tragedies or further chemical pollution, if you want. We also have some sectoral collaboration that is existing, like, for example, countries who do collaborate with one of the international organizations through specific projects and activities like, priority chemicals with WHO, or through ILO, or, for example, agricultural sector that works with FAO and works on and uses the methodologies and guidances that would lead to sound management of chemicals in their sector, for example. And there is, I see a clear, not only potential, but also need for collaboration with future SPP, in particular, and it wasn't, I believe, mentioned in Martin's introduction, that we also have, since September last year, we also have a global framework on chemicals that is now our umbrella instrument that is trying to help us globally to make sure that we are doing our efforts the best possible way to not only implement the sustainable development goals in all fields, including the chemicals and protection of health and environment, but also that we have an instrument and a body at hand that would be scientifically supporting this field. Because, as we were saying, the IPBES, so for biodiversity and for climate change, we already have a panel, but for chemicals and waste, which more or less represent the third pillar of the triple planetary crisis, and that's pollution, we don't have such a respected scientific body. So I wanted to bring this picture to you to see that we have certain gaps. Of course, there is another layer, because the mandate of the Science Policy Panel tells us that it is not only going to be supporting the global level, but also should be helping scientifically and supporting and providing valuable information, recommendations, but also some reviews to both regional and national levels, and to also a plethora of stakeholders. So there are some, of course, guiding, not principles, but that we have some guiding words in the mandate of the resolution of UNEA that is telling us that we have to prepare the Science Policy Panel, and that we also, the Science Policy Panel, have specific functions, and they are quite clearly defined. But the negotiations, as it was mentioned by Martin, those are still ongoing, and we will need to be adapting on how our work in the end will look like. And yes, indeed, some of the activities or outputs may also evolve over time during the SPP functioning itself, because we may see the need of really adapting them to as the time goes by. So what I wanted to share with you is what I would like that the Science Policy Panel produces, because, for example, UNEA, so United Nations Environmental Assembly, the highest global organization, if you want, or decision-making body protecting environment, has been tasked already 2 times to prepare global chemical outlook. And that's an exercise which is timely, consuming, also resource intensive. I think over 200 or 300 researchers have been involved globally in preparing this huge voluminous report. And I would actually see that this, instead of UNEA, the Science Policy Panel should be actually doing this work for next iteration when its time comes. I believe that is in 2 years, so from now, I hope. Then I think we've also, Martin has had that in his introductory talks, that the analysis that the Science Policy Panel would be producing would not only be retrospective, like what happened, what we already have, what we have released into the environment, what we are producing and what effect it has, but also to be proactive, to see what is coming up. And that may be partly covered by something which we currently call horizon scanning, but it's not meaning the function how horizon scanning is performed, but it rather means to make sure that we look and see at emerging issues, emerging chemicals, emerging problems of which we are not yet aware. And it does not mean it is something very timely consuming. It's rather than horizon scanning, I would say early warning, like message, raising up that this may be an issue. The scientists see some warning signals that they would like to pass on to decision makers to pay attention to specific signals that they are seeing. And for this, I could see this as a short early warning document, maybe 1 or 2 pages describing what is happening, what is the signal about, and not necessarily pointing out towards what is the direction, but rather saying, please, this warrants our attention. So that would be another output that I believe would be very useful for accelerating the possibility of actions of the global community really effectively protect environment and human health. And then I think that we still yet to see what would be the most effective collaboration in terms of sectoral collaboration, because we are using chemicals. It is not just it's very horizontal activity, and there can be very different requirements coming from different continents, because there's very different pattern use of chemicals, and also very different issues because of geographic landscape, because of the use patterns, because of the needs. So somewhere we may need more closely into pesticides and their safe alternatives, for example. In other places, we may need to be looking at effective remediation of chemicals or their alternatives, or sometimes we may just need to really make sure that we are having our guidance documents on the steps to take, the operating procedures, that we have them correct. So overall, this is what I could imagine that the Science Policy Panel would be doing in very brief, some examples. So just to put it in words, so not only to have reactive documents and having them retrospective, but really trying to prepare us as the innovations go by, that we are able to really issue early warning documents if we are seeing some signals that require or raise concern in the scientific community. Then some sectoral assessments linked to sustainable development goals and targets, because that could be also something that is helpful for global community when the community evaluates, okay, where are we? Are we really attaining 2030, 2050 targets? Where else have we accelerated? Where are we failing and why? And then, as I mentioned at the beginning, from the global perspective, I really believe that the new editions of the Global Chemical Outlooks for UNEP should be a task for global Science Policy Panel.
That was excellent. And also some of your suggestions for outputs were solid, excellent suggestions. Let's look for any questions that may have come in for clarification. And I think everything was pretty comprehensive. I have many questions, but they're not clarifying questions. So we'll save those for the discussion. And I think we can move on. Let's see, has anything? We're good. Okay, Bob, you're on.
It's a real pleasure to be here today to talk about the issue of chemicals waste and prevention of pollution. So the question is, what can we expect from a science policy process for chemicals waste and the prevention of pollution? And what can we learn from previous assessments? I think my talk will complement Katerina's perfectly. There's really no overlap at all, basically. What can we expect will depend on the functions that have to be agreed by the open-ended working group, and then, of course, later endorsed by governments. Now, the previous assessments that I'll mention are the WMO UNEP stratospheric ozone assessments, the IPCC, IPBES, the International Agriculture Assessment, the geo assessments, the IRP assessments, and making peace with nature. All of these, to different degrees, have had a significant impact on international environmental conventions. They've influenced national and subnational government and private sector decision-making. They've affected scientific research and public awareness. And so, in my opinion, an SPP for chemicals, waste and pollution can achieve all four of these objectives. Now, each of these assessments, and they are all independent of UN agencies and conventions, are inter and multidisciplinary. They are co-designed and co-conducted by governments and the scientific community. To be successful, we need natural scientists, social scientists, the humanities, economics, technology, law, business, all to be involved. And we need to recognize the diverse conceptions of nature, and therefore indigenous and local knowledge also critically important to have involved. Governments in each of these assessments approve the scope of the assessments. They also nominate experts. They review the assessment documents, and they approve and accept the final documents. This involvement is absolutely essential if we want governments to act. Again, an SPP for chemicals, waste and pollution should embrace these types of concepts. It's crucial that all relevant stakeholders are involved to different degrees in these assessments. So we need the NGOs, the private sector, financial institutions. In my opinion, most of these assessments to date have not had adequate involvement of the private sector or financial institutions. And I think that's a mistake, unfortunately. There are conflicts of interest approaches to make sure we don't have conflict, can manage biases, can manage conflicts of interest. But there is some real expertise in the private sector and financial organizations. A strength of the stratospheric ozone IPCC and IPBES assessments are that while they are independent of the conventions and UN bodies, they do directly inform the Montreal Protocol, the UNFCCC, the CBD, and associated biodiversity-related conventions. Again, an SPP for chemicals, waste and pollution, as you heard from Katerina, can influence the myriad of chemical conventions, both at a national, subnational, and global scale. All of these assessments that I've mentioned identify and quantify what are the environmental problems. They look at the impact of environmental changes on other environmental issues. They assess the economic and social impacts, and most important, they identify response options. They are policy relevant, but they are not policy prescriptive. All of these assessments that again I've mentioned, their primary function has been effectively assessments. IPBES, however, explicitly includes three other activities: capacity building. How do you formulate and can catalyze generation of new knowledge? They don't fund new knowledge, they catalyze it with research institutions, but they also very importantly support policy formulation and implementation, not by implementing action, but by identifying tools and methodologies that governments and the private sector can use to implement change. Each of these four functions are complementary and should be managed together. One crucial element of all assessment is an agreed set of principles and procedures to ensure that the processes are transparent, credible, and legitimate. Without that, these assessments cannot be powerful. The stratospheric ozone assessments provided the scientific and technical information that led to a complete phase-out of all significant ozone-depleting substances. How did they do that? They provided the evidence that chlorine and bromine containing compounds were destroying the ozone level. That was leading to an increase in ultraviolet radiation at the Earth's surface, and that was increasing the incidence of melanoma and non-melanoma skin cancer. And the Technical and Economics Advisory Panel, which included experts from the private sector, identified cost-effective substitutes. The IPCC assessments have provided the scientific rationale for the convention itself, the Kyoto Protocol, which wasn't particularly successful, and more recently, the Paris Climate Agreement to limit human-induced climate change to less than 2 degrees C and preferably 1.5. The IPCC provided unequivocal evidence that human-induced emissions of greenhouse gases were causing the climate to warm, with important consequences for human health, ecological systems, and social systems. They were also, more importantly, they had defined and identified policy and technological options for adapting to climate change and transitioning to a low-carbon economy. That's led to the Paris Agreement. IPBES, the biodiversity assessment, has provided the scientific rationale for the Montreal-Kunming post-2020 agreement. It quantified the loss of biodiversity, it quantified the drivers for change, the impact of the loss of biodiversity, and potential, again, response options for both conservation and restoration. Making Peace with Nature synthesized the findings of about 20 international assessments between 2015 and 2020. Like the ongoing GEO7, it addresses climate change, loss of biodiversity, land degradation, and pollution as interconnected issues. And it concluded that a major transformation is needed of the economic system, finance system, energy, agriculture, materials, and even the way we manage our environment. All stakeholders need to work together. So a key element of all of these assessments is the summary for policymakers, which were approved line by line by member states. These summarize the most important policy relevant findings in a less technical language, typically 15,000 words or less, and they are approved, as I said, line by line by governments. An SPP for chemicals, waste and prevention of pollution can assess individual chemicals, classes of chemicals, or chemicals associated with a particular sector, such as, say, agriculture. It could assess the importance of the chemicals, why are we using them, their impact on the environment, their impact on human health, and their impact on socioeconomic sectors such as water, food, and energy security. They can also look at policy and technical response options to limit the adverse consequences or suggest alternative chemicals to perform the same functions. Also, of course, the SPP can look at waste and pollution issues. Given the wide range of issues that could be addressed by such an SPP, I suggest it is critical, absolutely critical, to develop a priority setting framework based on the impact, not exposure, the impact of chemicals, waste and pollution on human health, the environment, and a subset of the SDGs. In addition to the development of a priority setting framework, I could also suggest that it should have a conceptual framework that can guide the work of an SPP. IPBES has found that the conceptual framework we developed there was incredibly important and played a critical role in all of their assessments and their other activity. The SPP, however, should not only focus on what needs to be done, but how to reduce the impact. Most assessments today have identified what needs to be done, but they haven't shown how to get the needed actions to be politically and scientifically acceptable? How can we overcome vested interest? How can we overcome corruption? What are the levers for action? Who needs to take those actions? And that this is absolutely critical, and we need to embrace a circular economy while we're also managing chemicals, waste and pollution. I've nearly finished. UNAIC has also recognised, and Katerina has also discussed it, an important function, and that is horizon scanning. This is not something done by IPCC, IPBES or GEO, so it is a new feature that we need to learn how to use the instrument carefully. Critical activities of any SPP are outreach and communication and partnership with other key stakeholders. They allow transparency, legitimacy, and they also stimulate public awareness. Last, but definitely not least, is the issue of capacity building. This is an issue of critical importance for developing countries, and as noted earlier, only IPBES explicitly has a capacity building function. They limit the scope to activities to help participate in the SPP itself and to identify options for action. They do not implement action, but they work with other UN agencies such as UNDP to identify opportunities to fund implementation activities. And my very last message is there are critics of both IPCC and IPBES. They argue they're ineffective because the climate and biodiversity conventions are not halting climate change, not halting the loss of biodiversity. This is a totally unfair and inappropriate criticism. The role of an SPP is to provide the knowledge needed for action. They are not responsible for the actions to limit climate change or loss of biodiversity. So it's critical, and it is true for an SPP for chemicals, waste and pollution, critical to differentiate the functions and the responsibilities of an SPP from the conventions. As I say, the role of the SPP for chemicals, waste and pollution is to provide the knowledge needed by governments, the chemical conventions and the private sector to move to sustainably managing chemicals, waste and pollution. Thank you.
Thank you, Bob. We have a lot of clarification questions here. This is great. It's, so the first one is, could you elaborate on how you would like to see the role and activity of the private sector for the panel?
Yes, the private sector has experts, just as governments have experts, the university have experts, the NGOs have experts. And so if a person is an expert in one or more of the issues being assessed, they would not represent industry. They would bring their industry expertise as an individual to assessing knowledge. In fact, all experts that are involved in assessments are there in their individual capacity. They are not there to represent their organizations. We also make sure in all of these assessments, we differentiate bias from conflicts of interest, and you need very strong conflicts of interest processes to make sure bias and conflict do not enter. So I believe there is some incredible expertise in financial organizations and the private sector that can help to understand what do we know about these chemicals and how can we manage them.
Okay, so one of the other questions then is that you mentioned IPCC, IPBES help to formulate policy in the outputs produced, and there is no separate policy committee in these bodies. So why is there now a proposal for a separate policy committee being discussed within for this science and policy panel?
Yes, the US government has proposed such a science policy panel. It has not been agreed, and right. It may or may not be agreed. I personally understand where they're coming from, but I also believe that the Bureau could actually deal with it. The Bureau is a little different from the multidisciplinary expert panel insofar as it does represent regions. And indeed, if one selected the right people, one could have some real policy expertise, actually both in the Bureau and intellectually on the multidisciplinary expert panel. So I think it's a question of whether or not a policy panel is or is not needed. We need to look at policy very carefully. That is almost the centre, in my opinion, of what we need. Whether you need a policy panel, that will be up to governments to decide.
There's always the risk of overcomplicating the structure and the efficiency.
Absolutely correct. Absolutely correct. I believe if you chose the right people for the interdisciplinary expert panel, chose the right people for the Bureau, make sure that you have a working relationship between the two panels. They could look at the intellectual, scientific, and technical issues as well as the policy issues.
I agree. All right, more questions. So what is your position on incineration as a solution of chemical waste management?
I'm not an expert on that issue, and I think it depends how it's done. I think one has to talk to other experts.
Okay, and then next one here, this is from France. Did you mention ISO and standards? And if not, what are the role of standards and standardization in the process?
Again, I'm not an expert on ISO standards, but they clearly play a major role. I did not mention them, but clearly one needs to look at all standard setting procedures, certification issues, etc. It's the same on all issues, whether it's chemicals, biodiversity, sustainable use, things like standards, certification, absolutely crucial.
Okay, and then we're saving this one. Could you elaborate on the 4 complementary assessments?
Yes, I actually do see it's actually one of the real challenges. There's incredible overlap at the moment between IPCC on climate, IPBES on biodiversity, and GEO looking at all of the issues. And they really have got some overlap. There are strengths and weaknesses in having overlap, to be quite. Different bodies report to different groups. IPCC reports to UNFCCC, but IPBES to CBD and the other biodiversity relationship, UNEP, GEO to UNEA. So some level of overlap is important, but I do think that we do need to try and get the work programs of all of the assessments, including this new assessment, SPP, to work together more than in the past. So I actually do see that most of the issues that will be dealt with in chemicals will be different from the IPCC, IPBES, and the stresses and the GEO, but there will be some areas of overlap. I think mostly probably in some of the areas of pollution, especially air pollution, water pollution, and land pollution. But no, complementarity is important, but some level of duplicate, not always bad.
Good. Okay, with that, I think we're ready for Rachel. Hey, Rachel.
Yes, hello. Thank you so much for having me here today. As Penny mentioned, my name is Rachel Radvany, and I work for the Center for International Environmental Law as an environmental health campaigner. So I will also touch on the unique contribution of the SVP in relation to other bodies, and also how can the work of the panel be most useful, and how can we ensure its credibility. And so I hope to complement and not duplicate the efforts of the other panelists on this webinar today. So with regard to duplication, I definitely agree that the way the SVP is set up and imagined right now, this shouldn't be too much of an issue. What Katka covered before was that in the landscape of chemicals, waste, and pollution governance, there's a small number of scientific bodies in this area, including the POPROC, the Persistent Organic Pollutants Review Committee of the Stockholm Convention, and the Rotterdam Chemical Review Committee. And these bodies look at specific substances for regulation. And of course, we should ensure that the Science Policy Panel doesn't revisit any of the topics that are studied by these committees, but the way that it looks right now, there's no real risk of this. And then also the unique horizon scanning function as well is something that is unique to the SPP. And then the other key difference is that these instruments are not specifically designed to increase the interaction of science and policy. They're governance mechanisms of chemicals and pollution and include a science body, but first and foremost, they are for chemicals governance. And it will be very important to coordinate with the existing institutions, both on chemicals and waste and also on other topics, as Bob was just discussing, for example, the bodies that cover the other two of the three triple planetary crises. And then lastly, the panel specifically should be able to receive requests from governing bodies of existing institutions, in particular, the Global Framework on Chemicals, the GFC, which considers chemicals and waste in the broadest sense, as the SPP is also meant to do. And just to note that there is already a provision in the text of the GFC making the link with the SPP, stating that the GFC will consider the outputs of the science policy panel, and as appropriate, it will invite assessments of the panel. In terms of prioritization, of course, there's hundreds of thousands of chemicals on the market with a range of impacts. So there's many, many topics that could be prioritized. But it's not just about how the topics themselves that are prioritized, but it's also about how they're brought to the panel. And this, of course, needs to include requests from member states, but it should also include requests from stakeholders, including independent scientists and rights holders. So, for example, Indigenous peoples should be able to bring requests based on their experience from Indigenous knowledge systems. Citizens should be able to bring requests. Citizen science is so important, as some things that may not be yet seen or reported on at the global level might be being experienced by people on the ground who are seeing things earlier. And so this should be able to be brought to the panel. And this also relates to the horizon scanning aspect of it as well. And then, as we know, there's also lots of knowledge from experiences from groups like women, young people, workers, and other groups and rights holders. And so all of these groups should be able to bring proposals and also should be able to contribute to the work of the panel and be present as observers. And this also ties back to the resolution, which mandates that the panel is interdisciplinary and has inclusive participation, including from Indigenous peoples. And so this is also one of the ways to ensure the panel's credibility. And the other thing that's connected to the legitimacy and credibility is the conflict of interest policies within the panel. There's tons of evidence in the chemicals and waste sector of entities with conflicts of interest intervening and influencing policies that are meant to regulate substances to protect human and environmental health. So strong conflict of interest policies should be set up to safeguard this process from that influence. Otherwise, the process could be delayed or the findings could be swayed to favor financial and political interests of industry actors. And again, this is also in the resolution. So both ensuring the panel is transparent and open to observers and that there are strong conflict of interest policies will contribute to the panel's credibility. And so if the panel has that credibility and transparency, and it's built with this multidisciplinary approach and strong conflict of interest, then the benefits of the panel will be greater. And it could bring more visibility to the chemicals and waste issues, which then, if this is coupled with political will, could turn into better regulation, more investments in research, and companies wanting to be the front runners in investing in safer products. And this is one of the ways that the panel can contribute to reducing hazards and impacts around the world. And as Bob mentioned, the capacity building is also an important function. So the panel could be an effective mechanism to build capacity of scientists from around the world in relation to policy decision-making, as well as building capacity for decision makers to make them more science literate. And this is one of the ongoing conversations that will be discussed at OEWG3 in Geneva. And lastly, it's really important to consider the communications aspect of this. So function C in the resolution includes that the panel should be encouraging and supporting communication between scientists and policymakers, explaining and disseminating findings for different audiences, and raising public awareness, among other things. And so a big part of those three things is ensuring that the outputs are able to be understood. And for this, you want to make sure that whatever comes out of the panel has a really strong communication strategy so that the reports are understood, become widespread, and then are actually taken into account in policymaking. And so most of all, I think it's important to note that what we mostly lack right now on many of these issues is policy action based on sound science. In many instances, we have the science and things are not being implemented. And of course, it's always great to have more data and more science about these topics, but in many places, there is already enough science to show us that we need to act, especially on the basis of the precautionary principle, which is one of the principles that is currently in the draft text of the Science Policy Panel. And so whatever assessments the panel itself will deliver will not be sufficient to get true effective policy action on preventing exposure to chemicals, waste, and pollution. And this is kind of what Bob was mentioning at the end, like this will have to be coupled with political will. And there's also the risk that the panel actually backfires and slows down even what's currently being done. And so we can't have this concept of paralysis by analysis, which is to say that many chemicals are not yet regulated and are kept on the market because the data is not fully available. So there's this ask for more data. And in the meantime, these harmful chemicals can stay on the market. And so again, I want to highlight that the precautionary approach is essential here, and the lack of full scientific certainty should not be used as an excuse for not taking action. And so just to close, there are ways where the panel can make a real difference, but the panel itself is not going to transform this dynamic that we're seeing right now of we have science that tells us we need to act on these issues, and then the political will isn't there. So, you know, the outputs are super important, but it's not necessarily the outputs themselves that will decide if the SPP is important, but it's the impact on the ground. So will there be less pollution? Will there be less impacts from pollution, from chemicals and waste? And how have the outputs of the SPP helped with this in one way or another? And so for the panel to succeed in doing this and contributing to this, we will need the transparency, and we will need the multidisciplinary approach, and we will need strong conflict of interest policies to ensure that the panel is truly contributing to protecting human and environmental health.
Thank you. All right, so the first question we have here is, what, in your opinion, what are the best ways to integrate citizen science as well as Indigenous people and local communities' knowledge into the framework of the Science Policy Panel?
Yeah, I think that's a super important question. I think the most important thing that I would say is it's not just about the science and the knowledge, it's about the people who hold that knowledge. And so the best way to integrate that is to integrate the people who are the holders of that knowledge and that science into the work that the panel is doing. And so that also ties back to the transparency and inclusive participation aspect of it.
Thank you. Okay, so our speakers have been excellent on keeping on time. So we are on schedule, and I can open the floor up to general questions now. The first one that I will add to your queue is, which avenues will exist for government policy colleagues to contact the Science Policy Panel?
I don't know in which order. Do you want us all to respond to this question, Penny, or how do you want us to go? If it's
possible, yes, you start.
Okay, yeah. So sorry, I didn't mean that, but it's fine.
No, there's only...
I can do that. It's no problem.
Yeah.
Right.
It's welcome.
As it was mentioned, the current structure or institutional structure, there will definitely be a plenary. There will definitely be a bureau. There will be definitely a secretariat for the Science Policy Panel. And then we are still discussing which way we will have a setup of specific task forces or working groups. So certainly the plenary will be an avenue where there is a way for government policy colleagues to address the panel, to work with the panel, because the members are, of course, the government in the plenary. As far as I understand this. But there will definitely be some other possibilities, because what we are discussing, for example, in the work-related procedures and processes, we're also looking at when an assessment or output is being prepared, there will also be, I mean, once the work program is established and there's a work going on, there will be also a possibility for back and forth communication and commenting on the drafts as they are prepared. So that's yet another avenue. And of course, the third, which I might have mentioned or should have mentioned as a second, in fact, is the setting up the work program. And that's also something that has to be decided by plenary. So this is also direct opportunity for governments to be involved. Thank you.
Anyone else?
Yes, I mean, as I said, governments will be heavily involved. Member states of an SPP are the ones that make all decisions. And so governments will suggest elements of the work programme. They will select the work programme. They will nominate experts for all of the activities, whether they're assessment, capacity building, policy formulation, etc. They will be part of the peer review of the draft documents, and they approve and accept the final documents. In fact, as I said, with the summary for policymakers, they approve it along with the lead scientists, word for word. So governments are heavily involved in all aspects. They have to be. They are the primary funders of the work programme, and therefore they are trying to decide at both a regional and global level what are the priorities.
All right. Rachel, do you want to add anything to that?
No, I think they covered it well.
Okay. And then I have some extra questions here. Okay, so the next one is, are there any ideas of how industry could be incentivized to share more of their confidential data on their products?
My only comment is, I don't know the answer to that, but it's no information can be included in an assessment unless it's publicly available. So there's no question we need to find ways to encourage the private sector to share some of their proprietary information. Otherwise, it can't be used in one of the assessments. That's been one of the challenges for all assessments. I think it will be a particular challenge for this SPP on chemicals, waste and pollution. The one time it worked well was on stratospheric ozone. There was a very good working relationship between the 17 companies that were the fluorocarbon industry and the scientists and the technical people when they did their assessment on teeth. But it did take a lot of discussion and confidence building and trust for them to share the data. But it had to become publicly available for us to be able to use it.
And Bob, what was that time scale? Would you say that was a 5-year time of building that trust?
Yeah, I mean, that would be probably about right, basically. It was predominantly through the 1980s. It was, and to be quite honest, it worked fairly well because, to be honest, the companies that actually caused the problem, the ones that produce the long-lived chlorine and bromine species, ICI, DuPont, Montifluorus, Allied Chemicals, etc., they'd all been doing two things. They'd all been looking for substitutes because they actually knew the writing was on the wall at one stage. Oh. And they also funded some of the fundamental research that was not censored, completely open. So they did play a role in both understanding the ozone problem, and they played a critical role in looking for substitutes. So once we demonstrated beyond doubt that chlorine and bromine chemicals were destroying ozone, were potentially leading to an increase in cancer, they actually became part of the solution. They tried to fight off regulations for a number of years, but at the end of the day, they were part of the solution.
See, it's the beyond doubt that is the critical point there, right? That could delay the cure for an unreasonable amount of time. That's the problem. But all right, so another good question here. How do we eventually prevent the dumping of waste from the US, EU, and Latin America to Latin America and Africa?
Well, I'm afraid this is not really a question to Science Policy Panel. It depends on political will and then strong regulations that we may have in place, because we have Basel conventions that does actually, ban this, but the implementation is apparently lacking. This is all I think I can say to this.
And then I have a question here from John. I think there was a commitment to create the panel for chemicals and waste in 2024. Is this commitment still hold by the international countries?
Definitely, it is, because the idea about the timeline is that we have the final OEWG3 now in June in Geneva, and then there will be intergovernmental, or there should be intergovernmental meeting by end of, hopefully, I mean, have we concluded successfully in June, then towards the end of 2024, there could be intergovernmental meetings setting up the SPP. That's the planning. But we are too early to say that the commitment is to be met or not, because we have yet to have the finalization of the work.
Is there a possibility for an open-ended working group 4 or no?
I don't know.
Okay. All right. So another question here is, should the panel tackle issues that are likely to be resolved or represent more idealistic ideas, and also include things that are more tedious to resolve?
I think they'll have to address both. And this is effectively where the governments will have to decide, with input from other stakeholders, what are the issues to be looked at. I mean, I could see effectively an assessment of all agricultural chemicals. How can we make the agricultural industry sort of safer, basically, from an environmental, human health standpoint? But I could also see an assessment, let's say, on lead. We know all of the scientific and health issues of lead, but the issue actually is more implementation of how to phase out lead in, say, and particularly developing countries. So it may not have a big science component, may only have maybe a response options. So I can see very broad assessments, but also some very narrow assessments. That will be the decision of the governments.
Okay, good.
Yeah, I would also say that it depends on the program of work, and then it should not go for easy questions. I think the role is also for sharing the information and making sure we do prevention. You know, we are looking at emerging issues as well. It's not only about, that's what I was saying, not only being reactive, but making sure that we are proactive, because this can really save us a lot of efforts and time, and also a lot of people's life and damage on the environment.
Okay, we have another question from Tom Harner. We have heard that the priority setting of the science policy panel should be impact-based and not exposure-based, but we have also heard that the precautionary approach is essential. So how can both approaches be included in priority setting for science policy panel?
Well, I'm not sure that I'm top expert on this, but I would say that we have to look at both aspects. It's environment and health that we are trying to protect in all the endeavors. So we have to include both. It's not only about exposure, and nor it is only about pollution. Because we have to look at it rather from holistic and exposome point of view, rather than just looking at one, be it environmental aspect or health aspect, but we have to look at the combination. I think maybe that it depends how prioritization process and criteria are established, and we are too early to say, but I certainly will, from whenever I can, be pushing that both are included in the process. Thank you.
Thanks, Katka.
I think something I would also add is just even in the title of the science policy panel, it's on chemicals, waste, and the prevention of pollution. So completely agree that that needs to be a focus as well. And also, if I could go back to the question about confidential business information, I just wanted to add one point, which is that in the Stockholm Convention, Article 9 states that information that is about the health and safety of humans and the environment should not be regarded as confidential. And so I just wanted to add that as something that we should be thinking about in this context as well.
Thanks, Rachel. Okay, the next question is, how could the regional centers of the Basel and Stockholm Convention for capacity building and technology transfer contribute to the next meeting of the open-ended working group and with the SPP itself?
Okay, maybe that could be a question to me because I'm also head of one of those centers. I work a lot with my government. You know, the colleagues who are going to meetings are consulting us. We are trying to prepare. I was part of the delegation, so I think if there is a possibility for your other colleagues from the regional centers to make the same connection to your national government, please do reach out. I believe colleagues will be pleased. Thank you.
Thanks, Katka. Okay, the next question is, do you know if there will be a system for government to do sector-relevant selection instead of ad hoc selection for variable participation to the process?
I think it depends on the inclusive. I mean, the mandate tells us it has to be inclusive. So we will have to ensure not only the geographical and gender and other balances, but this is also sectoral balance. And what Bob was discussing, you know, we have to have all the relevant fields, including socio-economic and not only nature science, but we have to make sure that as we said, chemicals and waste and pollution is a horizontal issue. So we have to make sure that all relevant sectors are involved.
Sure.
Good. Okay, the next question. How are you anticipating dividing the leadership? So this is working group co-chairs and across the region. So the IPCC model of the developed country co-chair receiving the bulk of the funding and therefore having the most power over the workflow is problematic. And it would be interesting to know whether this panel would try to avoid this from the onset. That's a Bob question.
I disagree with that criticism. It's that, I mean, first, assuming one goes with the IPBES model, which is a bureau and a separate expert panel, both will be geographically balanced. The bureau would likely, it's got to be decided yet, be about 10 people, just like IPCC, 2 from each of the 5 UN regions. The expert panel in IPBES, 5 experts from each of the 5 UN regions. And so by definition, you have more experts from developing countries on the expert panel, and you have more representation from developing countries on the bureau by definition of the way the UN regions are set up. Then IPBES has largely had a rotation of the chair of IPBES. It started in Asia with Zachary, then myself from WEOG, then it went to Latin America, now it's with Africa. So IPBES does a complete rotation of where the chair, which region the chair comes from. IPCC does it a different way, and they just vote. But it's voted by all countries, where obviously there's a majority of developing countries. They have voted for people, in this last case, for Jim Ski, who will be a brilliant chair. So I don't, and the chair has got no overall power on the work program. It's the member states that decide what that work program is, what are the global issues, what are the regional issues, and occasionally what are the sub-global. So it's a very, in my opinion, a very, very democratic process governed by the member states, but with input from other stakeholders, input from the conventions, etc.
Rachel, Katka, would you like to add anything?
Yeah, I would also like to add that I think that within the chemicals and waste field, we also have rotation of chairs of conferences of the parties, where the regions rotate. Every COP there is a different region. So for us, this is natural, and there is always, if there is a co-chairmanship, there is always a developed world and developing country co-chairs. They are always there. So it's balanced. So I would say that we are trying to keep this as a usual practice in the SPP. So I wouldn't really say that we are not keeping this one.
Yeah, maybe I should add one thing. I've always argued for co-chairs, trying to get both geographic balance, developing, and gender balance, to be honest. But actually, IPCC and IPBES, in both cases, demanded only a single chair. I think the open-ended working group should give serious consideration to having co-chairs for an SPP on chemicals, waste and pollution. Personal viewpoint.
That's a good point. Okay, so our next question is, do you know if there will be a system for governments to do sector-relevant selection instead of ad hoc selection for valuable participation to the process?
I mean, I would just say it's similar to the question about we had about the exposure and environment. It depends on the criteria how we are setting the work program. And as I would again say, it is a horizontal issue, so all sectors have to be covered, and it depends how we would, whether there is a specific order or whether we would have all the time the same criteria. It's hard to say at this very moment. We will have to consider there are multiple issues that we will have to be considering. Maybe we might be more effective if we do the sector specific, but it depends on what is the willingness of the negotiators at present. It's difficult to predict.
Let me add something. Assuming again the open-ended working group eventually has a system similar to IPBES, so you have a multidisciplinary panel, 5 people, 5 experts from each of the 5 UN regions. It's been incredibly hard to get good gender balance, incredibly hard to get good intellectual balance, because each region decides who they want to represent them, and there's politics within each region. Africa's got basically 5 sub-regions, so each sub-region decides who they would like for Africa. We are the same, the balance between the European Union and the non-European Union, the other countries of WEOG, US, Australia, Canada, etc. So while in principle, the rules of procedure for IPBES call for intellectual balance, you could call it sector balance as well, gender balance, not easy to implement it when the bureau members are chosen and when the members of the expert panel are chosen. But we should push governments to try and work together, regions working together, so you do have good intellectual balance, sectoral balance, and gender balance. That we should strive for that.
All right, we have an excellent range of questions here. Would it be a reasonable approach to exclude industry from a regulation process, like it has been done successfully in the regulation of tobacco in the US?
But an SPP wouldn't deal with regulations directly. They may assess regulations, but they certainly, an SPP would not be involved in trying to develop regulations. That would be the comment I would come up with.
Yeah, I would just add that we can have policy relevant, but not policy prescriptive recommendations. So we actually cannot even, I mean, not we, but the SPP will not be able to do that.
Yeah, exactly.
So here's a good one. How can and will the SPP secure long-term financing?
That's $1 million question.
That's right, literally.
With great difficulty. What we found, because I've chaired both IPCC and IPBES, at the beginning, for the first several years, both struggled with financing. But once they were shown to be highly policy relevant, highly useful to the international and national processes, both IPCC and IPBES now are on a much sounder financial basis. But it's year to year. Most governments can only promise a year in advance because that's their budget making process. But effectively, the SPP for chemicals, waste and pollution will have to demonstrate it has value to those that will fund it. A key question would be, to what degree would the funding come from government? To what degree one will allow for other sources of funding, including the private sector, including philanthropic foundations. So this is a big issue that the open-ended working group will need to discuss, because it's clear you cannot have influence of whoever funds it on the final work program.
Yeah, I fully agree with Bob, what he was saying. And I would also like to add that we cannot only depend, the chemical waste sector in recent decade has been really facing a lot of decline in resources, well, decline in absolute numbers. There was increase, but because the amount of issues that are to be tackled is also increasing hyperbolically, the absolute value of amount that is needed is also increasing, and that is not available. So we will have to be creative and have to look for other avenues, as Bob was saying, the foundations and philanthropic. That would be something which can be useful because that's also not necessarily biased in certain sense, because this is really trying to help accelerate the issue of increasing protection of both humans or human health and the environment. So I think we have to look at other options. Otherwise, we are competing for the same pot of money, more or less.
Rachel, do you have a CIEL perspective on that?
I would just add, echoing what Bob was saying about the making sure that there's no influence from the funding sources, and making sure that there's strong conflict of interest policies within the panel, but also when it comes to the funding. I would highlight that as well.
Yes, I mean, just let me add 2 sentences. It needs to be a blind trust fund. That means to say no one can dictate what's funded, and there should be no earmarking. Also, and that's well discussed in the IPBES rules of procedure, a key issue for the open-ended working group to look at carefully.
Thank you. Okay, the next question is, how can impacts of chemical pollution be weighed or compared against other impacts that IPCC and IPBES are combating in cases where the chemicals are used in particular contributing to decarbonization, in products contributing to decarbonization or to reducing land or water use? So the overlaps that we discussed earlier that are...
I would, yeah, go ahead, Bob.
Yeah, I would assume, depending what assessments are requested and approved by the plenary, the key then would be scoping those assessments, and one would want to look at all of the relevant human health issues and all of the relevant environmental issues. And you would look at to see where there are synergies between different approaches, but also unintended consequences, where a chemical may be very good for climate but bad for biodiversity, or etc. So I think one would want to look at the positive aspects of chemicals as well as the negative aspects of chemicals.
And I think we also see, I think it was also mentioned before, the potential for synergies, because I think if we just keep in our silos of pollution, of biodiversity, of climate change, we are not, the experts do not understand each other. And basically we have the same goal. So we have to collaborate. So this is not about overlaps. It's really about finding the way how we understand each other properly and working jointly.
I would also add, I think this is why it's so important to include, have the broadest possible inclusive participation, and have, people like citizen science and indigenous peoples and, people that are on the ground and experiencing these impacts be included, because that's also a way of bringing in those perspectives of like how these chemicals are actually impacting people on the ground. And as Martin said in the chat, of course, you have to look at all of the trade-offs and just like really ask the hard questions about the different benefits and who it's harming, which is why it's important to have those people in the room to talk about that.
And it is also very important to have the trust built, and that's what we were speaking from the very beginning. So to have sound knowledge base, as you mentioned, Rachel, to have relevant stakeholders, but also to be strong enough and have the trust built among all, those who are using the products of SPP, that we are doing it from the best available knowledge and understanding, and we have considered carefully all the points, the trade-offs that we have.
Okay, we have time for a couple of more questions before closing remarks. So the next one is much of the science is already known, but implementation is lacking. And what then is the role for the SPP?
As I said earlier, I think more and more on all of these issues, whether it's climate, biodiversity, chemicals, waste, and pollution, we broadly know what the problems are. The issue is, what are the response options that are cost effective, politically and socially acceptable? So I would envisage that in whatever assessments are decided by the member states, that effectively a strong focus will be on response options. GEO7, which I'm currently co-chairing, what we've noted is we keep on telling people how to do something, what to do. It's the how. So, for example, for years, we've been arguing we should repurpose subsidies. They normally don't help poor people. We should internalize externalities in the cost of, say, food and energy. Now, the problem is when you do those two things, the price of energy goes up, the price of food goes up. How can you make that politically acceptable and socially acceptable? How can you recycle the revenues? So a lot of work has got to be done on how to make the chemical industry more sustainable. What are the approaches that politicians are willing to take, the private sector will embrace, and the public will embrace? So I see this being personally a major challenge for all assessments, not just this one that we're talking about here.
Yeah, what I wanted to add here is also that we have to communicate better. Not only what is the issue, but the options that we have, and that we have sometimes difficult options or recommendations. But if we don't do that, then the delaying the action is making it worse. So that's really also a communication issue that we have to really emphasize.
Okay, for the sake of time, this is our last question. And this one here is based on the fact that the chemical industry and waste industry are multi-trillion-dollar industries with which externalize the costs and the burden onto environmental and human health, where the costs are transferred. So what is your perspective on that and the basic polluter pays principle?
As I've said, I think it's rather important to look at repurposing subsidies and to internalize externality. In other words, the polluter pays. That was a major conclusion of literally all recent assessments, making peace with nature. I would expect it will be a major conclusion of GEO7, but of course we haven't finished our work on GEO7, but we're certainly talking about repurposing subsidies, internalizing extra. But as I said, the question is, how do you make it politically acceptable? But I think it's something that has to be given very serious consideration.
Katka?
Yeah, I am of the same opinion. I mean, we have been working on this for many, many years, trying to say, okay, why do governments have to, prove that there is harm going on, and in fact support the industries who are very well off. So I think in some instances the legislation has been successful and transferred some of the costs to the industry, but not everywhere. And we have to find ways how to be able to do it globally, because the industry is also using the same earth as we live on.
Rachel?
Yeah, I would just add, I just put a link in the chat. Hopefully everyone can see it. I think I sent it to everyone. CIEL and IPEM, the International Pollutants Elimination Network, have a report on a globally coordinated fee, a tax on chemical producers, that I think is really relevant to this discussion as well.
Thank you very much. So thank you again to our speakers. And I would like now to introduce our co-chair, Miriam Diamond, who will be summarizing and closing remarks.
Thanks, Penny. Thanks to all the speakers. What amazing discussions, and your insights, your responses to the variety of questions. Thank you to all the participants. I'm saying the thank yous now because I don't want to forget the thank yous. Thanks to all the participants who added great questions. And of course, and behind the scenes, well, there's Penny and Martin, and behind the scenes, I just want to thank the board of the International Panel on Chemical Pollution. Now, okay, what did we hear? Wow, what a rich discussion that we heard. So the importance, first of all, it's the importance of the SPP in living up to filling an important gap in the existing huge universe of the chemicals and waste sphere. As Katka showed, there are many existing multilateral environmental agreements. However, there are spaces in between and there's a lack of integration. So all of our speakers, Bob and Rachel, all of our speakers spoke to the importance of having an overarching body that is able to address issues. And those issues are retrospective analyses based on impact. Who is deeply affected? What are those major issues? Proactive assessments of emerging issues that will come from one of the functions of horizon scanning. Horizon scanning is unique to this science policy panel on chemicals and waste. And as Katka suggested, early warning, signals of early warning so that we can avoid large costs of issues that are emerging. And then Bob and also mentioned sectoral, and Katka and Rachel mentioned sectoral assessments, for example, for chemical classes, in order to assess alternatives to avoid, and we need to understand alternatives in order to get to solutions. So that is the last point that I want to raise, and the take-home message. The SPP derives considerable authority because it will be an intergovernmental panel with support from multiple governments. We heard also about the need to integrate multiple disciplines. The key function of the SPP is to deliver policy relevant, not policy prescriptive advice, not just on what could be done, but how it can be done. And we heard, for example, in the conversations with Katka, Rachel, and Bob, it's also about implementation. How can we have palatable solutions to avoid the costs associated with human and environmental health degradation that can be embraced now by governments in different regions, by the private sector, by different actors? That's the key question. It's not that we don't have solutions, but we often don't have the pathway towards implementation. So with that, because I've got like maybe 1 minute left, I just want to thank you again for participating, for all our speakers, for Penny as moderator, Anna Zale for behind the scenes coordination. We will be posting the recording of the talks on the IPCP website, and also stay tuned because we will be hopefully publishing a paper that will summarize some of these points. Thank you so much for participating. Looking forward to us all behind activating the SPP. Thanks and bye.
Thank you very much. Have a good day, everyone. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Goodbye.